I want you to compare these classic movies with their remakes or prequels. There are many differences, but one that stands out is their color. Somehow, the original films, some of which came out almost a century earlier, look better. They're filled with vibrant colors that pop and transport you to another world, while their new versions use dry, lifeless tones. And this isn't just about these films. It's a pattern across most modern movies. So, what's going on? Why is this epidemic of colorlessness happening? I tried to find the answer, and what I discovered is more fascinating and inspiring than I ever expected. At the center of it all is a revolutionary technology that, as of a few days ago, might be lost forever. But for all of this to make sense, you first need to know who its creator was. Herbert Kalmus did not want to make movies. He was an engineer from MIT with a PhD in physics. For him, the world of arts was completely foreign. He was a man of numbers. He was someone who loved technological and scientific challenges, solving them as if they were puzzles. In the early years of his career, Herbert Kalmus worked in various areas of engineering, including the weapons industry during World War I. This experience allowed him to acquire valuable skills in applying advanced technology, which would be crucial later in his life. In 1915, Kalmus, along with his wife Natalie and a team of researchers, faced the greatest challenge of Herbert's life, one that many believed impossible at the time: creating color motion pictures. You see, most movies of the era were in black and white, as early film technology couldn't capture a full spectrum of colors, and the methods available were either expensive, inconsistent, or simply didn't produce realistic color. The two most popular methods consisted of hand painting each frame, which could become a titanic task and didn't look natural, or using color filters when projecting a film, similar to a kid's toy, with results that left much to be desired. In other words, Kalmus faced the greatest challenge of his entire career, creating true color cinema, and he took upon himself the task of solving it. But this wouldn't be easy. The challenge that Kalmus and his team developed wasn't immediate or simple. First, they tried a system with plates, but it failed due to its high cost. Then, they attempted a two-strip process, which proved too complicated. Far from discouraging Kalmus, this series of failures had the opposite effect. As they tried to perfect color cinema, something gradually changed in Kalmus. Little by little, the hard and stiff man of science softened toward this new art form and gradually fell in love with it. As he would say, his interest in color cinema began as a technical curiosity, but quickly became an obsession. Instead of settling for what already existed, he and his team sought a more advanced solution, a process that would not only be economically and technically viable, but could also transform the cinematic experience and elevate this new medium to high art. They wanted movies to capture life as it is and transport audiences to new worlds. You see, at that time, most people thought of movies as mere fairground attractions or children's games, something to pass the time. Back then, the US government didn't even consider movies as art protected by free speech. But in 1916, the start of what would change that happened. That year, they would have a breakthrough. They developed a process that used two strips of film to capture red and green tones, then combined them to create a color image. The result was a bit basic and would be improved in the following years, but make no mistake, this was a technology that would change how movies were made from then on, becoming the gold standard in the industry. Its name, Technicolor. Later in 1917, after Kalmus and his colleagues founded the Technicolor company to commercialize the so-called Technicolor System 1, they released their first self-financed film. This was a small comedy, which would be the first full-length color movie made in America, and was titled The Gulf Between. Sadly, I can't show you footage of this film since it's considered lost media due to a fire in the 60s, with only a few fragments remaining that I unfortunately don't have. The tragedy doesn't end there, as the film can be considered a failure. Although it was made with the intention of being shown at just a few events, it was the first and last film to use System 1. After its premiere, Technicolor abandoned System 1 and began work on subtractive color processes that did not require a special projector, due to how complicated the system proved to be outside the controlled space of the laboratory. However, Kalmus remained optimistic and didn't give up, and life would reward his effort. In 1922, they managed to create Technicolor System 2, which still only detected red and green, but not blue, the only color they needed to finally represent the entire spectrum of colors, but was easier to use for commercial productions. The first film shot with System 2 was The Toll of the Sea in 1922, which was a critical success, with reviewers praising the realism that color brought to the film. However, the real big hit would come 3 years later with the third film shot under Technicolor System 2, The Black Pirate. As strange as it sounds, this was the first film in history to be shot specifically with the idea that it would be exhibited in color, and it shows. Its success was so great that it's even referenced in more modern productions. Despite the great success of Technicolor System 2, it still had many problems. It was very expensive, still couldn't record blue, and required many lights aimed at the actors to properly detect colors. This could make studio filming feel like being inside an oven, which is probably why films shot with this technology technology, opted to film many of their scenes outside, where this wasn't such a big problem. However, anyone who takes photos or records video can tell you that shooting outdoors is never the easiest option, especially in that era when everything was recorded on film, not digitally, a point that will become more relevant in a moment. But back to our story. We're in 1932, and Kalmus and his team had finally created what he had been working on for so long, dedicating almost 2 decades of his life. They had made a truly revolutionary leap because they could finally capture the 3 primary colors of light: red, green, and blue, allowing for a much richer and more realistic color reproduction. They had created the Technicolor 3-strip process. Unfortunately for Kalmus, just as he finally achieved what he had longed for, color film, he did so right in the middle of the Great Depression, one of the greatest, if not the greatest period of financial problems in US history. The Technicolor company felt the hard consequences of this event and had to make many decisions to keep the company afloat. The development of the 3-strip Technicolor was extremely expensive and had left the company in a poor financial situation. They had to substantially reduce their prices and cut their 1,200 workers to just 230. In other words, they lost 80% of their workforce, and even that wasn't enough. No one wanted to hire them, and it seemed quite possible that the company would go bankrupt. The last thing the remaining movie studios wanted to do was spend what little money they had on an expensive technology that wasn't seen as necessary at the time. The public was still going to see black and white movies. For a moment, it seemed like Kalmus's dreams were about to end, just as he was about to achieve them. But fate seemed to have other plans for him, or so it seemed until Kalmus had an idea. What if he offered his technology to an animation studio? Due to how the animation process works, they would need fewer cameras, and many of the problems caused by using Technicolor would no longer be issues since they wouldn't be working with actors when filming the scenes. And luckily for Kalmus, one small animation studio of the time had a problem. The studio is not very well known, perhaps you've heard of it. It's called Disney. Their previously popular series of shorts, Silly Symphonies, had stopped working, and Walt Disney saw in the 3-strip Technicolor a way to repopularize the Silly Symphonies. Under Technicolor's recommendation, Disney would remake the black and white animated short Flowers and Trees from scratch in order to bring it to color. It's no surprise that this raised costs through the roof, potentially ruining Disney financially. It was a huge gamble. Basically, they bet everything on green, and it worked. The cartoon proved so popular that the profits made up for the budget overage. Flowers and Trees was the first animated film to win an Academy Award at the 5th Academy Awards in 1932. And here's where we enter somewhat ugly terrain, where we begin to see the monopolistic techniques for which Disney is currently famous. Disney signed an exclusivity contract with Technicolor to use the 3-strip system for 5 years. With the success of Flowers and Trees, and subsequently 3 Little Pigs that same year, which became a gigantic success and also won an Oscar the following year, Technicolor became the name of the game in the animation world. But since the 3-strip system was exclusive to Disney, other studios had to stick with the inferior 2-strip system too, causing several studios to disappear because they couldn't match Disney's quality. Disney would become almost synonymous with animation, making it to this day the largest animation studio in the world, giving it much control over how this industry and currently the entire film medium is managed. Look, I won't defend Kalmus for making the decision to be exclusive with Disney, but I will say that first, the man didn't have a crystal ball and couldn't know what Disney would become. And second, seeing the health of his company and the market at that time due to the Great Depression, I can't blame him. I would have made the same decision. Little by little, Technicolor gained power over all of Hollywood, with films like Snow White cementing Technicolor as the standard in cinema. From this point on, Technicolor's influence was so great that even today, in the year of our Lord 2025, many people still believe, and probably you do too, that The Wizard of Oz, which was shot on Technicolor's 3-strip system, was the first color film in history, despite the fact that, as we've seen, color film had existed in one form or another for almost 3 decades. Between the 1940s and 1950s, after the exclusivity deal with Disney ended, is when we can see Technicolor's peak in the industry. After a few years, directors started to know how to get the most out of the technology and began to use color as a narrative tool. We can see this in films like Singin' in the Rain from 1952, which used the vibrant colors that films could now have to make people feel more immersed in the magic of the musical, or in The Red Shoes from 1948, where red was used as symbolism for obsession and passion. Kalmus and Technicolor were at the height of success. All of Hollywood was at their feet. Everyone wanted to use their technology. He had finally achieved the success he so desired, and was helping to consolidate cinema as high art by giving the film world a new tool, color. However, I just mentioned The Red Shoes, and it's ironic that I did so, because if you mention a film with red shoes, it's not the 1948 film that people normally think of. It's The Wizard of Oz and Dorothy's shoes, which are actually dark burgundy. Contrary to what is commonly thought, Dorothy's slippers are not red, even though that's the color they appear in the film. And there's a simple reason for this. as we'll see in a moment, and it's part of why color is disappearing in modern films. In the 1950s, right at the peak of Technicolor, a new technology began to emerge that would replace it: Eastman color. This was not only cheaper and easier to use, but instead of using 3 strips of footage that were later joined into a single image, as the 3-strip Technicolor did, it recorded on just a single strip. This literally meant using only a third of the footage without the enormous camera of more than 200 pounds that Technicolor required, or the machine that had to be kept in a separate room because it produced so much noise and made recording any audio impossible, or the need for so much light that generated high temperatures. The only downside was that the color it produced was much less vibrant and more muted than Technicolor. However, from the 1960s onward, this technology would gain strength, not only because it was used by many independent or lower-budget filmmakers, but because the 60s and 70s became eras of counterculture. The younger generations opposed what previous generations had been doing. In translation, Technicolor films were beginning to feel old and outdated, and represented everything the new generations hated. A great example of this is the film Bonnie and Clyde from 1967, which is normally seen as the beginning of New Hollywood, a movement in American film history from the mid-1960s to the early 1980s, when a new generation of filmmakers came to prominence. But back to Bonnie and Clyde. At that time, Hollywood was having problems. It was releasing mega-production after mega-production, and each was failing. Then along came a low-budget film that no one gave 2 cents for, which used Eastman color and not Technicolor, and it became the biggest hit of the year. From there, everything went downhill for Technicolor. What the public wanted now were gritty stories. They wanted realism, stories like Taxi Driver from Scorsese or The Godfather from Coppola, stories for which the whimsical, color-filled world of Technicolor seemed out of place. By God, the fact that Star Wars, the most famous film of the era, if not in all of movie history, which is high in fantasy and literally begins with a phrase similar to a fairy tale, the literal genre with which Technicolor became popular, wasn't even considered for filming in Technicolor tells you everything. Unfortunately, Kalmus died in the 60s, watching how his creation, to which he had dedicated so many years of his life, so much effort, so many tears and blood, was slowly dying along with him. Everything got worse with the new millennium and the introduction of digital cinema replacing film. And now, I'll finally answer the question from the beginning about why the vast majority of modern films seem allergic to color. Remember Dorothy's slippers and how they weren't actually red but dark burgundy? That decision was made because Technicolor, and for that matter, any machine that takes photos or videos physically on film or photographic paper, inevitably modifies the color, which means creators must take this color change into consideration when filming. This doesn't happen with digital, or at least not to that extent. Due to how digital cameras work, they allow a greater degree of color control over the image than ever before. But this comes at the cost that the base recording they take has a very desaturated and dull color. This way, the video has the most information possible recorded and allows the production to have greater control over it. This isn't bad. In fact, you can almost perfectly imitate the Technicolor look with these cameras. However, since the base video comes with very muted colors, and the more it stays that way, the more control you have over the final product, it ends up being easier if you don't modify the base video color much. And if you're someone like Marvel, where you make your movies basically on an assembly line, and you literally don't know if you'll see your actor's face or their mask until literally right before premiere night, being able to have maximum control over your film's color becomes fundamental. The less color you have, the easier everything becomes. If you repeat these same incentives across many years throughout the entire industry, plus add the increase in gritty and realistic cinema of the 2000s following the New York Towers, it's easy to see what would happen from miles away. And that's not all. Recently, in February 2025, the Technicolor company went bankrupt, potentially taking with it much of the knowledge and technology, due to a concept called path dependence. For example, have you ever wondered why the USA builds houses from wood, unlike almost the rest of the world? Well, this is because, despite it not really being the easiest or cheapest way, nor really the most sustainable way to build a house if we look globally, it is if we focus only on the USA. When the first settlers originally arrived, they used what they had at hand to build their houses, wood, and little by little, an entire industry was created around it. Those who cut it, those who treat it, those who transport it, those who sell it, etc. Over the years, this industry becomes so large that it's actually easier to build a house of wood than of concrete blocks, for example. And if you don't believe me, my American friends, tell me, if I ask you to build a wooden house and ask you where you would buy the materials, you would instinctively say Home Depot or Lowe's. But if I ask for a concrete block house, where would you go? What type would you buy? What mixture would you use to join them? And how many would you need? It's basically a circular thought if you analyze it a bit. I build my house of wood because there's an entire industry around wood that makes it easier for me to use that material. And there's an entire industry around wood that makes it easier for me to use that material because I build my house of wood. It's not impossible, but it is very difficult for a market to break out of that vicious cycle, and something similar happens to the movie business. We still hear of filmmakers like Tarantino or Christopher Nolan who are purists and only use film, refusing to use digital, but those are filmmakers already in their 50s and 60s. Just as in the 60s with New Hollywood, when new generations moved away from Technicolor due to how difficult and expensive it was, we are watching in real time how they are leaving film for digital. You know, the idea of shooting a movie with your iPhone camera is becoming more popular every day. Heck, I can assure you that neither Nolan nor Tarantino, for all their film purity, edit their movies in the traditional way by physically cutting and gluing the footage. I'm sure they just scan the film and edit it digitally. Little by little, film is dying, and with Technicolor is basically the same story. How many current filmmakers know how to use the technology? Heck, how many Technicolor cameras even exist? And what will happen to the few that remain when a piece breaks? The company that created them no longer exists. Basically, what I explained with houses in the USA is happening to Technicolor and film in general. Since everyone is using digital, now even more due to streaming, the entire industry that produces cinematographic equipment produces practically only digital equipment, which causes only digital to be used, and so on and so on. This makes cinema with muted and desaturated colors increasingly common, even more so in the streaming era, where this desaturated color gives even more advantages. However, there is still a ray of hope. There are still movies like Spider-Verse, film studios like A24, or whole industries like anime that refuse to see color die completely. Perhaps without knowing it, they continue the legacy that Kalmus began almost 100 years ago, because people may die, but ideas are immortal.